My name is Maren Whitlock. I'm 32 years old, and for 23 years, my birthday has technically also been my sister's. I plan weddings and corporate galas for a living, which means I spend my working life making sure other people's most important days go exactly right, down to the second, and I have never once, not once, since I was 9 years old, had a birthday that was actually about me. This past October, standing in my parents' backyard next to a cake that said "Our Miracle" in pink icing, while 40 relatives sang happy birthday to my sister Ivy, and I stood off to the side holding a stack of paper plates like hired help, a woman I barely recognized from my mother's book club walked over, squeezed my arm, and said, "Congratulations on the trust news, sweetheart, that's such wonderful timing." I had no idea what she was talking about. Nobody had told me there was any trust news at all. That single sentence, said kindly, by a stranger, at a party that wasn't mine, was the first thread I pulled on a lie my family had been telling for over 3 decades, and by the time I finished unraveling it, I understood exactly why I'd spent every October of my adult life quietly disappearing at my own family's request. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the person everyone forgot to celebrate is usually the one keeping the receipts. If your family has ever made you feel like a supporting character in your own life, this one's for you. Subscribe and drop a comment before we start, because the reason my parents built an entire mythology around my sister's birth turns out to have almost nothing to do with a miracle at all. I should explain the shape of this before I explain the depth of it, because the shape is what everyone in my family agreed to for so long that I stopped questioning it myself. My sister Ivy was born on my 9th birthday 3 weeks early, after what my parents had always described as 7 years of secondary infertility and 2 devastating miscarriages between me and her. She spent 17 days in the NICU. My mother tells the story of those 17 days the way other people tell stories about surviving a car accident, breathless, tearful, grateful, in a way that swallows the whole room, and I understand intellectually why a baby who almost didn't make it becomes the center of a family's gratitude. What I never fully processed until this year is that gratitude for a child who survived and erasure of the sibling who happened to share her birthday are not actually the same instinct. Even though my parents treated them as inseparable for the rest of my childhood, every October since I was 9, my birthday became Ivy's miracle day. There was a cake, always the same phrase in icing, "Our Miracle," candles for Ivy, a slideshow of her NICU photos projected onto the living room wall, while I sat at the edge of the couch in party clothes nobody had asked me to wear. My mother would occasionally remember, usually around 9 at night when the guests were thinning out, to bring me a small unfrosted cupcake from the kitchen with a candle stuck crooked in the top, and I'd blow it out alone in the hallway while everyone else was saying goodbye to Ivy's guests. I want to be honest that as a child I didn't fully register this as strange. Children absorb the shape of their family as the shape of the world. It wasn't until I was in my 20s, describing my birthday plans to a college roommate and watching her face change from curious to horrified as I explained the cupcake in the hallway tradition like it was a quirky family custom, that I understood other families didn't do this. I called my closest friend from event planning, a caterer named Yasmin, who'd worked dozens of weddings alongside me, and had over the years become the person I told things to that I couldn't quite say out loud to my own family yet. I told her about the cupcake tradition for the first time in the 10 years we'd known each other, and she went quiet on the phone in a way that told me more than any reaction she could have voiced, before she finally said, "Maren, that's not a quirky family thing. That's something you should probably look at directly instead of around." I didn't take her advice immediately, but I didn't forget it either, and it sat in the back of my mind through everything that came after, a small permission I hadn't given myself yet to actually look. The first contradiction came home with me from that October party, in the form of a single sentence I couldn't place. I called my mother the next morning casual, the way you'd ask about a scheduling mix-up, and asked what Carol from book club meant about trust news. My mother's voice did something I'd later learned to recognize as her tell, a beat too long before she answered, followed by a laugh that arrived slightly ahead of anything funny having been said. "Oh," she said, "that's nothing yet, sweetheart. Just some paperwork with Grandma's trust, don't worry about it. We'll talk when it's finalized. I asked what needed finalizing. She said it was boring, technical, and that I had enough going on with the Hendricks wedding I was managing that week, which was true, and which she knew, and which she used, deftly, the way she'd used 100 small deflections over the years, to close a door before I'd fully realized it had been open. The first hidden detail arrived 4 days later as a voicemail I almost deleted without listening to, from a number I didn't recognize with an out-of-state area code. A woman named Rosalind Kwan, identifying herself as the administering attorney for my late grandmother's family trust, asked me to call her back at my earliest convenience regarding a beneficiary designation change request that required my confirmation. Beneficiary designation change. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time before I called her back, because those 5 words meant something specific to me professionally. I'd handled enough vendors, contracts, and event insurance riders to know that a designation change request implies someone initiated a change, and the only person who could initiate a change to my own beneficiary status was, as far as I understood trust law, me. The trust shift happened the following weekend at a family dinner I'd normally have skipped, but curiosity pulled me there instead. My father, who has spent my entire life playing the role of the quiet, agreeable peacekeeper in our house, the one who nods along to my mother's version of events and rarely offers one of his own, flinched, visibly, when I mentioned Rosalind Kwan's name at the table, a full-body flinch that lasted less than a second, but that I clocked immediately, the way you clock a structural crack in a wall someone's painted over. He recovered fast, changed the subject to Ivy's engagement, which had apparently just happened that week. Another piece of family news nobody had thought to tell me directly, and I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth, understanding that whatever was in that trust paperwork, my quiet, agreeable father was not as separate from it as my mother's breezy dismissal had suggested. I watched him more closely for the rest of that dinner than I had in years. The small habits I'd stopped noticing because they were simply the wallpaper of being his daughter, and I saw something I hadn't let myself see before, that he deferred to my mother constantly, not out of laziness, but out of something that looked. I was actually paying attention, more like guilt he'd been carrying so long it had calcified into personality. He refilled her water glass before she asked. He agreed with an opinion of hers he'd argued against not 20 minutes earlier when Ivy wasn't in the room. I drove home that night turning over a question I'd never once thought to ask in 32 years, which was what, exactly, my quiet father had spent his whole marriage being quiet about. The personal betrayal came from an old planner I found almost by accident, 3 weeks later, helping my mother clean out a hall closet while Ivy was busy with wedding dress appointments. It was a day planner from the year I turned 9, spiral-bound, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore, and tucked inside October, in my mother's handwriting, was a note that stopped me cold standing in that closet with dust in my hair. Ivy's miracle day, keep it simple for Em this year, she'll understand when she's older. She'll understand when she's older. I was 9 years old, and my mother had already decided, in writing, in advance, that my birthday would be absorbed into my sister's for the foreseeable future, and had already prepared the explanation she planned to give me eventually, as though the erasure itself was the plan, not an accident of circumstance that simply kept happening year after year. I stood in that closet for a long time before I put the planner in my bag instead of the donation box. 2 days after that, when Rosalind finally reached me by phone at a decent hour and explained, carefully, what the beneficiary designation change actually involved. My grandmother's trust, funded by the sale of her house and a modest but meaningful stock portfolio, had always split evenly between Ivy and me, 50-50, a structure my grandmother herself had set up 15 years earlier, specifically because, Rosalind mentioned almost as an aside, my grandmother had told her once that she didn't want either granddaughter's birthday circumstances to ever become a financial one too. My grandmother, it turned out, had noticed. The proposed amendment would reduce my share to 15% and redirect the remainder to Ivy, citing, in the paperwork itself, wedding expenses and long-term financial stability needs. 15% of a trust that had over 15 years of compounding, grown to just over $400,000, was not a small adjustment. It was most of what I'd quietly assumed, without ever discussing it out loud, would someday help me buy the small event venue I'd been saving toward for 6 years. The unexpected ally was Rosalind herself, though it took her another conversation to become one in any meaningful sense. She admitted, with the careful hesitation of someone choosing every word for liability reasons, that she had reservations about the amendment when it first came in, because the request had arrived with a signed consent form attributed to me, but no direct verbal confirmation, and something about the timing had felt rushed to her. She said she asked my parents directly whether I'd agreed, and they'd told her yes, that I was simply too busy with work to handle the paperwork myself, and had given verbal authorization for them to submit it on my behalf. She said she'd wanted something in writing before finalizing it, which was, she admitted, the only reason this conversation was happening at all, instead of the amendment already being complete. I asked her why she was telling me any of this now instead of just processing it the way my parents apparently expected her to. She was quiet for a second, and then said, "Because you called me yourself, unprompted, 4 days after the change request came in, and that's not what a person who already agreed to something usually does." The evidence that changed everything arrived by email 2 days later, a scanned copy of the consent form Rosalind had on file, my name typed at the top, a signature at the bottom that looked, at a glance, unsettlingly close to mine, the kind of close that comes from someone who has watched you sign things before and knows the general shape without knowing the specific rhythm. The form was dated for a Tuesday in September. I opened my calendar without even fully deciding to, because some instinct told me exactly what I'd find, and there it was, a boarding pass confirmation still sitting in my email from that same Tuesday, a flight to Denver for a CL relevant to the fitting schedule. It wasn't. It was Ivy writing, "Just get Em to sign it, or have Dad do it. She never even reads that stuff carefully. She'll be fine once she sees the amount is still something." My sister, who I had spent 32 years quietly excusing as the innocent center of a favoritism she hadn't asked for, had known exactly what was happening to my share of that trust, had participated in planning around my signature rather than getting it honestly, and had assessed correctly, as it turned out, that I'd never bothered reading trust paperwork carefully enough to catch it, because I'd spent my whole life not expecting my own family to need that kind of scrutiny from me. The stakes became formally legal the following week, when I retained my own attorney, a methodical woman named Beatrice Anyema, who specialized in trust and estate disputes, and filed a formal notice of contest with the corporate trustee overseeing my grandmother's account, citing the forged consent form and the verified travel records that made in-person signing impossible. The corporate trustee's own compliance division, once notified of a credible forgery allegation, was obligated under the terms of their fiduciary duty to launch an internal investigation independent of anything I decided to pursue personally, which meant, whether I wanted it to or not, this had stopped being a private family matter the moment Beatrice's letter went out. Beatrice was blunt with me in a way I needed in our first real strategy meeting about what this process would and wouldn't feel like. She told me trust litigation rarely produces the dramatic reckoning people imagine from movies, that most of it would be quiet correspondence between attorneys and a compliance team that moved at its own careful pace regardless of how urgently I felt about it, and that my job for the next several months was mostly going to be patience and documentation, not confrontation. I remember being disappointed by that at first, some part of me wanting the courtroom scene I'd absorbed from decades of television, before I understood that the slowness itself was the protection, a system designed to be difficult to manipulate precisely because it refused to move at the speed of anyone's emotions, including mine. The hidden motive surfaced through a long, uncomfortable conversation with my father, alone, at a diner neither of us had ever been to before. The kind of neutral ground people choose when they need to say something they can't say inside the house where the lie was built. He told me, haltingly, that Ivy's fiancé's family had money, real money, the kind that made my parents anxious about how our family would look by comparison, and that Ivy, terrified of seeming like the less established half of the match, had come to them panicked about wedding costs and a down payment on the townhouse she and her fiancé wanted, and that my parents, out of a fear they'd carried about Ivy's stability since her first 17 days of life, had simply decided the trust redistribution was the fastest way to make the problem disappear before anyone in the fiancé's family noticed there was a problem at all. It didn't excuse the forgery. It did explain, in a way that made my chest ache instead of just burn, why the fear had felt urgent enough to justify it to them. The difficult choice arrived that same week, sitting in my car outside the diner with Beatrice's draft complaint open on my phone, evidence complete enough to make this ugly and public if I wanted it to be. Timed 3 weeks before Ivy's engagement dinner with her fiancé's extended family. I could let this detonate there, in front of the people my parents were so afraid of disappointing, and watch 32 years of being erased get avenged in the most visible way available to me. I sat in that parking lot for almost an hour, running through what that dinner would look like. Beatrice's documents on the table between the shrimp cocktail and the champagne toast. My mother's face in front of the very people she'd spent months trying to impress. And some part of me, the part that plans other people's most important nights for a living, understood exactly how devastating that timing would be, precisely because I know better than almost anyone what a ruined event actually costs a family in ways that outlast the evening itself. I decided against it, not out of forgiveness exactly, but because I understood, sitting in that car, that the version of justice I actually wanted wasn't a spectacle, it was simply the truth being acknowledged by the people who owed me that acknowledgement, and a public detonation would have made the story about my anger instead of about what had actually happened. I called Beatrice the next morning and told her I wanted this handled entirely through the trustees' process. No public disclosure, no confrontation timed for maximum damage, and she told me, in the driest tone I'd heard from her yet, that most of her clients wanted the opposite, and she respected that I didn't. The hidden history came from my Aunt Ruth, my mother's older sister, who called me out of nowhere the week after the diner conversation and asked to meet, alone, at her house, in the specific tone of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and has finally decided the weight isn't hers to keep. She told me, gently, that the story of Ivy's miracle conception after years of infertility wasn't entirely accurate. My parents had, in fact, been separated for 4 months the year before Ivy was born, a separation the family never discussed, during which my mother had a brief relationship with someone else. When she and my father reconciled and she discovered she was pregnant shortly after, my father had quietly arranged a private paternity test once Ivy was born, a detail Ruth had only learned because she'd been the one to drive my mother to the lab. Ivy was his. Biologically, the test had confirmed that clearly, but Ruth believed, and I came to believe it too, the more I thought about it, that the fear my father carried during those months before the results came back, the fear of loving and raising a child who might not have been his, had never fully left him, and that the elaborate, all-consuming miracle narrative my parents built around Ivy's birth wasn't really about gratitude for a baby who survived the NICU. It was about a family desperately overcorrecting for a doubt they'd never spoken aloud, wrapping Ivy in so much celebration that neither of them ever had to sit with the 4 months they didn't talk about. Ruth told me one more thing that afternoon that reframed my own childhood more than anything else in this story. She said that in the months right after Ivy was born, before the miracle narrative had fully calcified into family religion, my mother had gone through what Ruth now recognized, with the benefit of decades and better language, as a real depressive episode, one nobody in the family had a name for at the time, and that some of the earliest instances of my birthday getting quietly absorbed into Ivy's hadn't been calculated at all, just a mother too depleted to manage 2 occasions and unconsciously choosing the one wrapped in the most relief. It was only later, Ruth said, once the pattern had already hardened into tradition, that keeping it going became a choice rather than an accident, the note in that drugstore planner proof enough of exactly when the shift happened. I don't share that detail to excuse what came after. I share it because understanding where a wound starts doesn't require forgiving everything that grew out of it, and I needed, for my own peace, to know the difference between the two. The power shift didn't come from confronting them with that story, which I chose, deliberately, never to do, out of a mercy I'm still slightly surprised I had in me. It came instead from the trustees' compliance investigation, which concluded, based on the travel records and a forensic handwriting comparison Beatrice had commissioned, that the consent form's signature was not consistent with verified samples of mine on file, and formally voided the amendment, reinstating the original 50-50 split my grandmother had designed specifically to protect me from exactly this kind of family arithmetic. The desperate countermove arrived exactly as Beatrice warned me. It might in the form of my mother calling 3 separate relatives before calling me, painting a version of events in which I was jealous of Ivy's happiness and trying to sabotage her wedding out of resentment I'd apparently been nursing my whole life. My cousin Priya texted me, hesitant but honest, to say Aunt Carol's been telling everyone you're trying to ruin Ivy's engagement over money. Is that true? And I understood, reading that message, that my mother's instinct under pressure had always been the same one she'd used on me at 9 years old: control the narrative first and let the truth catch up whenever it was convenient. I didn't respond to Priya right away, and when I did, I kept it simple, a single message explaining only the facts Beatrice had already cleared me to share publicly, that a forged document had been submitted using my name and that I'd contested it. Nothing about motive, nothing about Ivy's role, nothing about what I'd learned from Ruth. I watched, over the following days, that single restrained message do more to quiet the family narrative than any angry rebuttal could have, because it didn't sound like resentment. It sounded like exactly what it was, and people who'd known me my whole life as the reliable, unflappable one found it easy to believe the calm version over my mother's breathless one, which was its own strange kind of justice I hadn't anticipated. The evidence that finished closing the gap arrived almost accidentally through Ruth again, who'd kept a box of old letters after a close family friend of my mother's passed away the previous year. Letters the friend's estate had returned to Ruth as the closest surviving connection to my mother's side of the family. Buried in that box was a letter my mother had written to that friend during the separation, dated months before Ivy was born, admitting the affair in her own handwriting, describing her fear that my father would never fully trust the baby was his, even if the test came back clean, and asking her friend, plainly, "How do I make sure nobody in the family, especially the girls, ever has a reason to ask questions about this?" Ruth handed me that letter without ceremony, said she thought I deserved to have the full shape of it if I was going to be the one holding all the paperwork anyway, and I sat in her kitchen and finally understood the complete truth, not as an excuse for what had been done to me, but as the missing architecture underneath it, the 4 months nobody discussed, the paternity test nobody mentioned, the miracle narrative built specifically large enough to bury a secret 2 people had decided, when I was 9 years old, would cost less if it cost me something instead. The final confrontation happened at my parents' kitchen table, the same table where Ivy's Miracle Day cakes had been cut every October for over 2 decades, with Beatrice's documentation in front of me, and deliberately, nothing about the letter or the paternity test anywhere in the room. I laid out the forged consent form, the travel records, the trustees' compliance findings, and I watched my mother's face do the same controlled flattening I imagine it had done at 9 other family reckonings I'd never been allowed to witness. My father didn't defend the forgery. He said quietly that he'd typed the form himself and Ivy had signed it, copying my signature from an old card I'd given her years earlier, and that he'd told Rosalind I'd verbally agreed because he genuinely believed, in the moment, that I would have agreed if they'd simply ask me properly, which was, I told him, exactly the kind of belief that lets people justify almost anything as long as they never have to test it against the actual person they're deciding for. Ivy came in near the end of that conversation, having heard raised voices from the driveway, and for a moment I thought she might deny knowing anything about it the way she had, presumably, planned to if it ever came up. She didn't. She sat down across from me, twisting her engagement ring, and said, quietly, that she'd been so scared his family would see her as the less put-together sister that she'd stopped thinking about what she was actually asking anyone to do to get her there. I told her I understood being scared. I told her I didn't understand deciding my signature was hers to spend. She didn't have a good answer for that, and for once, Neither of us tried to manufacture one just to fill the silence. The legal and financial consequences settled, over the following months, into something proportionate and unglamorous. The trustees' investigation formally restored my original 50% share, a correction now sitting in a separate account Rosalind helped me establish under my own sole authority. No criminal referral followed, because the bank's compliance team, similar to how these things tend to resolve in families rather than courtrooms, concluded the forgery had occurred within a family context without clear intent to permanently deprive, a legal distinction that mattered more to Beatrice's file than it did to how it felt sitting across from my sister at that dress-fitting weeks earlier. I put a meaningful portion of the restored trust toward a down payment on the small event venue I'd been saving toward for 6 years, a converted greenhouse space on the edge of town with good bones and terrible lighting that I've spent the months since slowly making my own. There's a specific satisfaction in that I didn't fully anticipate, walking through a space that exists because a system designed to protect exactly this kind of inheritance did its job. Finally, the way my grandmother had built it to. I think about her sometimes standing in that greenhouse at dusk, and wonder if she suspected, all those years ago, writing that even split into a legal document specifically because she didn't want either granddaughter's birthday circumstances to become a financial one too, that she was building the exact wall I'd eventually need. The emotional justice, when it arrived, looked smaller and quieter than anything I'd have predicted at 9 years old, blowing out a crooked candle alone in a hallway. I didn't attend Ivy's wedding. I sent a gift, generous but not extravagant, and a card that said only that I hoped she built the kind of life she wanted, which was true, and which cost me nothing false to write. I stepped back, deliberately, from the role I'd occupied my whole life as the family's quiet fixer, the one who shows up early and stays late, and never asks for the same in return, and I let that stepping back be its own answer to 32 Octobers of cupcakes in the hallway. The final quiet revelation came this past September, going through a box in my own closet I hadn't opened in years, looking for decorations for a client event, and finding, tucked inside an old photo album I didn't remember owning, a single photograph of myself at exactly 1 year old, my mother's handwriting on the back, Marin's first birthday, the happiest day. It was dated a full 8 years before Ivy existed, before the separation, before the miracle narrative, before any of it, a photograph of a woman who had, at some point, loved her first daughter's birthday enough to write those 5 words on the back of a picture and keep it. I don't know why it ended up buried in a box in my own closet, instead of a family album, whether my mother gave it to me at some point I don't remember, or whether I took it myself as a child sensing somehow that it needed protecting. I don't think that photograph undoes anything. I think it just means the woman who wrote Ivy's Miracle Day, "Keep it simple for M this year" in a drugstore planner was once, briefly, capable of something uncomplicated, before fear and secrecy taught her to build a smaller life for one daughter to make room for the story she needed to tell about the other. This October, for the first time in 23 years, I threw myself an actual birthday party, small, at my own apartment, 6 friends, a cake, with my own name on it, and icing that said nothing about miracles at all. I blew out every candle myself, in a room full of people who had shown up specifically for me, and it didn't feel like triumph exactly. It felt like something closer to arriving somewhere I should have been able to reach a long time ago, if anyone had simply left the door open. That's my story. 1 forged signature, 1 drugstore planner, and 32 Octobers. It took me to notice the pattern had a paper trail the whole time. If this reminded you that being the reliable one doesn't mean you stop deserving to be seen, take that as your sign to look a little closer at what your own family's convenient explanations might be covering. Share this with someone who's ever felt like the background character at their own birthday. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.